Good. So yeah, I'm just going to spend a little while telling the story of the perspective that's emerged from me over the last period. I've ended up calling Volution, and it'll become clear why as we go through it. But the key is how we need to get beyond our linear thinking in order to be able to heal the pain of the trauma of our split to the earth, and then therefore enable us to unlock the promise to the consciousness and the abilities that potentially we have that will enable us to move forward collectively as humanity in harmony with the rest of the planet. So the thesis in a way is that our linear developmental evolutionary concepts are really at the heart of the problem. And this can be quite challenging to some people in the spiritual movement because a lot of spiritual development has been about transcendence, the idea that we have to get beyond the body and transcend up to something else. Well, that's one part of the journey, but that's only one part. And if you only do transcendence and you forget immanence, which is about presence and connection, then we disembody and we move away from the body, the earth, and everything else that we actually chose to incarnate into. And the interesting thing when we explore this whole concept is there's this idea of linearity in time, and that progress being linear is actually quite a relatively recent phenomenon and only emerged after we've been through our survival and our tribal development, where we actually experience reality as much more secular and seasonal in its time. And so there was a point in our development where that experience of time as more circular moved into becoming a more linear expression of time. So we take it for granted that time is linear and things progress and development goes that way. Well, I'm questioning that. I'm saying that that's been a temporary development and that we've now actually reached the limits of what that perspective can do for us. And in fact, it's causing more problems than it is creating solutions for us. And we need to transcend it, include this whole idea of linearity, but we really need to start moving beyond it now. And when you look, for example, at this idea of where humans are in the context of the rest of life, as Ervin Laszlo and Jude Currivan say, we literally stand midway on the scale between the nuclear and the galactic realms, between the micro and the macro. How can that be? Is that just chance? Or is there something else going on here? It's not like, one is bigger than the other. Somehow we seem to be at the center of this scale. So how does that work? At the same time, when we look at time, I think many of us have had the experience that when we want to take a next step in our development to expand our consciousness, we suddenly bump up against all these old patterns from the past that we have to deal with to enable us to take that next step. And the metaphor I like to use is this image of the tree, that for the tree to be able to send its branches higher, it needs to be able to drop its roots deeper into the earth. And as we expand our consciousness higher, we also have to drop our roots back down into the past to release energy that might be held there that enables us to grow up into our next phase. So that is also less of a linear process, because we're noticing that, as illustrated in this image, that past and future are actually dynamically interconnected with each other. That it's not we move from one to the other, but they're actually evolving together through an expression in the present. And that's how, likewise, we can see this idea of the tree. So that's what I want to explore, this whole questioning of linearity and why getting beyond that is critical to humanity surviving really into the future with the rest of the earth. Another thing that puzzled me was how come we're now discovering that many ancient civilizations seem to have developed thinking and technology that we're only coming back to starting to understand. That they had They had deep expressions of the underlying dynamics of life that they had carved into their monuments. They were able to build these incredible structures, and we have no idea how they did it. And yet we're starting to learn that what happened there, and the imagery that we're discovering links to our newest scientific breakthroughs. So in a linear developmental understanding, we were assuming that was a less complex society, and maybe in terms of moral development at one level, that might be true, but at another level it seems not to be. So what was going on there? And then I spent a long time working with the whole models of development of individuals and collectives that we see a lot in Ken Wilber's work, that I spent much time with Dr. Don Beck and the spiral dynamics model, which is what you can see here, which goes through these phases of development and which is extremely useful and empowering as a framework that enables us to understand we need to meet people where they're at in their own development, because they can't go anywhere else except be where they are. And so how do we enable the life conditions, create the habitats that enable people to express themselves in a healthy way at their own phase of development? But then I went into a piece of research with a friend called Dylan Newcomb, who is a dancer and a choreographer, philosopher himself as well. And what he did is he put hundreds of dancers through an exercise to express different vowel sounds and see what their bodies did when they expressed these vowel sounds. And there were 8 different vowel sounds. He then linked them also to an in and out breath, which got to a system of 16. And he was familiar with spiral dynamics as well. And he contacted me and said, I'm noticing an interesting pattern that I'd like to explore with you. And what he noticed was that those dynamics that were emerging through that embodied research seemed to map to the core dynamics of the 8 levels of development as expressed in spiral dynamics. However, there was something slightly different about what he discovered there. Because what they discovered was that there were some core dynamics that went through the first 4 systems, but then those dynamics seemed to repeat themselves in a kind of mirror from the center point. So he expressed this in yin-yang dynamics. He found a match between the energy dynamics he was discovering in the body and the sound with the I Ching. And these are the descriptions of the key energy dynamics through a yin-yang perspective, where the yin is the white and the yang is the black. And so what you can see if you look carefully is that the pattern at level 4, the blue level, is mirrored at the orange level. And then you see that the red and the green are mirrored, that the purple and the yellow are mirrored, and that the beige and the turquoise are mirrored. And actually what it goes from is more fundamental, pure yin-yang dynamics. You can see the very top are pure white, pure black, and then it comes and differentiates itself towards the center. So what was going on there? Because what the dancers were experiencing is that the energy dynamics were fundamentally the same in those systems, but the higher level systems, say orange through to turquoise, had a more subtle expression of the equivalent system earlier on. So there was something else pointing to a non-linearity in the development and pointing to this core center point. We also experimented with the chakras and noticed that the chakras were actually the transition energies between these stages of development. So if you imagine you've got these stable stages, and then there are energies that help you move from one to the other, as it were. And that was the role that the chakras seemed to play. And very importantly, right at the center of the system that seems to connect everything up is the heart chakra. So the image that I got as I was inquiring into this, how can it be that it's not just one step after the other that we were thinking about, but there seems to be a correlation from the external systems moving in from beige and turquoise, the kind of holistic, what we call turquoise system, to this precognitive experience of unity, which is what beige is, very embodied system, that there's a mirror between them, and that they then move in and out actually like this, rather than moving one step up at a time. And I came across this concept of tensional integrity or tensegrity. And what that means is that you have a tension, and it's the tension that manifests the form. And the form holds the tension. So I was like, okay, so you've got this kind of tension between beige and turquoise in a way. And then what happens is that they pull in towards the center. So that tension is holding a dynamic. And the image that I'd had for a long time in my mind was the image of a torus. And that is how I started to understand how these processes worked, not in a linear way, but in a much more organic way, like a torus. And this is the torus, is the form that you can see in the background here. And when I was sitting one day thinking, okay, so we've got evolution going one way, but we also talk about involution, where things come into form. Evolution, things expand from form. Involution, things come in. But I didn't see them as two linear processes. I said they are one process that's going on here in this torus. So what do evolution and involution have in common? Well, if you take off the in and the air, you get volution. I was kind of, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what volution means. I had no idea. So I looked it up, and it means spin. And everything in life in the universe spins. Cells spin, our planet spins, everything spins. And this is, of course, what the torus does as well. So then I knew I was onto something. So the way this works geometrically is that if you look at the science around geometry and form and manifestation processes, what is called the unified field is actually a set of tensions held in place by a certain geometry. And this is what holds it static, as it were, as potential. And it's when there is a pull on that field from a need in the world, you could say, or a niche in the ecology, where something needs to fill a gap, there's a vacuum, there's a need for something, then that creates the tension between current reality and desired reality. And it's that tension that activates this unified field and this geometry to bring something into form. And it looks like this. So you've got this toroidal form, and then you have this layer of manifestation at the center. So this is the simple kind of graphic representation that I made. I'm going to talk you through of how this process actually works. You have this creative tension then between what I call the seed and the potential. And the seed, as you will know, is very dense matter. And potential is a kind of field of possibility. So it's much lighter in its structure, as it were, whereas a seed is very dense. Potential, subtle, you could say, and seed, very dense, gross matter. And they essentially grow into each other. So the potential that is held as subtle information in the field grows into the seed, and the seed expands into that field. And what that creates in terms of a torus is this surface that could be called a brain. And a brain, it's spelt this way, but interesting that it's also the brain as we spell it the other way, like a membrane, is what holds all the information of the system. And that information is its potential that can be turned into form. Literally in formation. So back to this image, you can see you've got the seed, the potential, and the surface. Brain is this surface of the torus that wraps around the outside with the manifestation layer at a 90-degree plane at the center. So you've got this pull between the two tensions. And interestingly enough, I put the heart chakra here because it seems to be at the center of all of this. And the very first organ that is actually evolved in the womb is the heart. And everything else grows out from the heart. So we have this tension between current reality, possible reality. That creates a movement that starts to manifest at this central point. And there are three main elements to this that tie in to the core trinity that you see back in many religions and spiritual traditions. At the one level, you have the manifest, which is the world as we know it around us. At the other extreme, you have the container, which is all the possibilities and potential that this form could manifest, the container. And then you have the dynamics, that is the process of the current reality, the seed, as it were, growing into its potential. Okay, so you've got what is manifest, you've got its potential, and you've got the process that goes on as those two interact with each other. And when you look at the traditions, you could see the container reflected in different language, like the Sacred Father and Sacred Mother. Often Sacred Father is seen as potential, Sacred Mother is seen as the container that holds you with unconditional love in the present. The Madonna, the absolute, the one, the unified field. And if you look at the Volution thesis that I'll give you a link to later, I've got a whole table of how the different traditions have language that reflect these core dynamics. So they're basically describing the process of life. And this container around the outside you could also think of as the soul, because it's the field that holds all the possibility and potential of the particular entity. And what the soul journey is of the entity is to take all that potential and see if it can manifest it into form. At the manifest level, we have like the container, which is the one. At the manifest is the many. So the one and the many. Or in the Christian tradition, the Christ and the Mary. You get this distinction, right? The container is just oneness. Then you get this distinction, this differentiation into the yin and the yang, the Christ and the Mary. That then moves us into the relative reality. And then you have the dynamics in between, which has been called spirit, Shekinah, the subtle energies. There are many, again, different words used, but I think it seems that they're all different cultural expressions of this fundamental dynamic of life to manifest itself. So this process actually also has a geometry to it, and this is Buckminster Fuller's Jitterbug, that goes through a certain number of geometric forms, breathing in and out of this tension field that is the evolution process. If you remember, you've got seed and potential. This is the dynamic that goes on, and what he describes is how essentially information flows throughout the whole system between the manifest and the potential the whole time. And the actual geometries of these take you through the key geometric forms, the Platonic solids that we know are the core foundational building blocks of all material life. So you're going through this system of potential into manifestation through these different geometries. And what you see is literally a breath. And there are many traditions who have talked about life in the universe as basically being a breath, a breathing process. So not a linear process that goes from A to B, but a breath of in and out, that's continual flow of information in an interaction between matter and potential. And for those interested in sacred geometry, what you see is that the parts within this process are continually refining themselves to become closer to this Fibonacci sequence, or phi, which they call the golden ratio, which is the ideal proportion between parts and a whole. So during this process, as life is shaping up, it's refining its relationships between part and whole. We could say the general directionality of life is increasing interconnectedness and increasing differentiation at the same time, which makes sense, because as things get differentiated out into their unique part or piece, you get more space for relationship between them. So more differentiation, more connectedness, and the relationship between the parts and the whole become increasingly refined, closer to this natural design that we see in the golden ratio. Okay, so I then looked into, if we've got this process, what's the relationship between our linear developmental understanding and this evolutionary process? Because as we know, you don't transcend and reject a certain process or understanding from the past. You look to transcend and include it, as I would say, better to expand and embrace. So I discovered 4 phases that seem to be a template underneath these kind of developments. And on the left here, you can see how they describe the growth of plants, where you've got the field of potential and information as this bulb above, and you've got the matter growing into it. So it literally says here, the earth forces are concentrated in the seed, right? Then dissipated up. Life throws matter up, opposite to gravity, and the cosmic forces come into the material world. So you've got the information coming in and the matter growing up, and as information comes into matter, it expands it, right? From the dense seed into the beautiful objects and plant life and everything else that we see around us. So these phases. In the first phase, essentially, energy is built up within the boundary of the seed. So you've got this entity, it's contained within its own self, and it's building up its energy within that. In the second phase, the energy breaks through the boundary of the seed. So you could see the little seedling, as it were, as the leaves burst out. And at that point, when you expand out beyond your own boundary, you become aware of yourself and the other, that there's you and the other. There's me, and then there's the world out there. So we break through the boundary of the seed to expand. In the third phase, our energy continues to expand from that initial push, but is able to turn around, look back, and see and reflect on itself, become aware of itself. So if we think of that midpoint in the development of the spiral that we looked at, those colored phases, that's the point where the self-reflection comes in. And in the final phase, the energy slows down, integrates everything else, encapsulates the elements from the past, which is critical, and we'll come to in a minute. It means you've got to realign the past, integrate it all into one, and then that seed becomes the fruit. So the seed has become the fruit, and the fruit becomes the seed for something else in the future. So this is how you might see it map like against an octave system, like the spiral here, where the first two systems fit with the first phase, and then the next two. So it's two of the value systems for each of these phases, for example. In some of the other theories and perspectives on linear development, this is how it would map. So some people talk about the lunar phase, and then the solar phase, where we individuate, and then the integration of the lunar and the solar. Or some could say feminine to masculine, and then integration. Or the original participation, it's been called, which was the precognitive experience of unity, our separation out, and then the final participation, the integration of the precognitive with the cognitive into a transcognitive phase. A key part of this development is that in the first half of the development, the entity is developing unconsciously, in the sense that patterns have been laid down through past behaviors that we follow unconsciously, what Rupert Sheldrake might call the morphic fields. And those fields shape the pathways. The pathways, Ken would call them the kind of cosmic grooves, have been laid down that we just follow blindly, as it were, because we're just trying to work out how to do things. And then there comes that point of self-reflection where we decide what our pathway is going to be. So what are we going to add to the existing pathways? So that's the self-awareness that comes in at that point. And in that process, as we reach this kind of midpoint, we need to go back and we need to revisit the past. So as we attempt to grow consciously, what happens is that we're reaching up for more consciousness, and that you could see as light. That consciousness or light we bring in, and that light or consciousness enlightens our shadow. So the greater the light, the clearer the shadow, right? So we see that we need to transform that shadow, that pain that's held from this unconscious development in the first phase, the trauma there, is holding energy that we need to make the next step in our development. Remember the tree image. If you want to shoot your branches higher, you have to dig the roots deeper. And once that energy is released, that enables our growth to the next phase. So if we want greater freedom, we need greater integration. And in that process, the energy creates, in a way, once we've completed these phases, it becomes the seed has grown into a fruit. The energy is now contained and integrated, and that becomes the seed for something else. And then it all starts all over again. So if we take that understanding and apply it to where we are now as humanity on the planet, and just use this model of human development over time, then the key thing that I see that has gone on is that when we moved from the first two phases here, which were precognitive, experiential, yin-based, because their foundational assumption was connectedness, even though it wasn't a cognitive awareness, it was an experience of. And we then moved into, and this is the earth, remember, so we are the earth. So this is an experiment of the earth that at this point decides, wouldn't it be interesting if I could see myself, become aware of myself, reflect on myself. And so in this process, we differentiated out, so the ego, in the sense of separate self, emerges and is therefore able to see the other. And in order to do that, you have to differentiate between the previous phase and understanding and the new phase to create space for the development of the ego. But if that differentiation becomes a disassociation, then in psychology they would say that is what becomes a pathology and a trauma. Because instead of transcending and including the past, you've transcended and repressed it. So in our Western development, what seemed to happen is around this phase, we weren't able to somehow transcend and include this previous earth-based feminine sense of belonging to this oneness of the planet. We weren't able to, we were somehow, for some reason, maybe so fearful or afraid of the wildness that contained. And in that context, you had the emergence of what became the traditional religions, who decided that, in fact, God was out there and we needed to put in place a hierarchy to be able to control the wildness of nature, the wildness of the feminine. Why do you think we burnt all the witches? Because they represented direct access to wisdom in the world around us. They represented a wildness that was frightening to this separated ego that wanted to have its own identity and not be dependent on or related to something else. So that core trauma, in my hypothesis, is what lies behind all the problems that we've got on the planet at the moment. Because in our development, we've kept going, but in a way what we're doing is we're continually trying to run away from this trauma from the past, and we keep creating all this stuff in the world around us, but we're doing it with a complete lack of awareness that we are the earth. And if we had that awareness, there's no way we could have done what we have done to the planet, because we'd have realized we're ultimately doing it to ourselves. And so that is the key. And until we actually are able to reintegrate that precognitive sense of belonging and safety and trust, that, by the way, brings great rest. And if we look at our Western society, if anything is missing now, it's rest. Because it enables you to sit and rest and be with. Until we're able to do that, because that's also what integrates the relationship to the body, we're not going to be able to get access to the next yin phase, where we're able to integrate the yin and the yang and actually get access to the world of subtle energies, the wisdom of nature, to be able to use that consciously to design the solutions that we need to get through this transition. So until we've dealt with the pain, we don't get access to the promise. And I want to finish just with, so I didn't just think this up myself, I've come across it in different places, and I want to finish with some quotes. Sometimes people write things so clearly and powerfully that there's no point in trying to summarize them yourself. So I'm going to read you 3 quotes, first from Ken Wilber, from his book Up from Eden, that describes this moment. The ego, in the necessary course of its emergence, had to break free of the Great Mother, right? The early phase, those first 2 phases, a feat represented in the hero myths. So all the hero myths are essentially about the emergence of the ego. But in its zeal to assert its independence, it not only transcended the Great Mother, which was desirable, but it repressed the Great Mother, which was disastrous. It is one thing to gain freedom from nature, emotions, instincts, and the environment. It's quite another to alienate them. The Western ego did not just gain its freedom from the Great Mother. It severed its deep interconnectedness with her. And then he goes on to link it to time, so this question of linear time. Since nature body is the referent of seasonal time, remember, circular, secular time, and since mind is the referent of historical time, linear time, the severance of the mind from the body meant a corresponding severance of history from nature. So severance means split. Once the ego was cut loose from seasonal nature and from the body, it has no felt roots in which to ground its otherwise higher order awareness. Remember, we split off after those first 2 levels, and the rest, therefore, has developed out of context, without any roots. It then seemed perfectly acceptable to the ego to begin a premeditated assault upon nature, regardless of the historical consequences of such activity into the future, because history and nature were no longer integrated. Right, so our linear sense of time had lost context with natural cycles. Likewise, the ego failed to comprehend that an attack upon nature was already an attack upon its own body. We're the earth. We forgot that we were the earth. So that the whole project was, in the deepest and truest sense, finally suicidal. Which is why human existence is what is at threat at the moment on this planet. Not the earth. It's not save the earth. The earth will continue. It's save humanity. And a final quote from Ken, because it's such a beautiful summary of it. When the Great Mother, those earlier systems, is repressed, the Great Goddess is concealed. So for us to be able to get access to these higher level yin systems, the yellow and turquoise and the spiral, the holistic systems, we're going to have to integrate the Great Mother that we repressed. So when the Great Mother is repressed, the Great Goddess is concealed. And one may, it's a terrible realization, look in vain through Judeo-Christian Islamic religion for any authentic trace of the higher touch of the subtle goddess herself. In vain. It's not there. And that would become a perfect and terrifying comment on an entire civilization. And the last one from David Abraham that really wraps it round and says why Volution as a perspective and a practice is so key to the future. The conceptual separation of time and space, right? We've separated out time and space. The literate distinction between linear progressive time and homogeneous featureless space. So you've got linear time and you've got nature, and we've forgotten, as Ken said, to connect the two. Functions to eclipse the enveloping earth from human awareness. So it's not part of our experience. We've transcended and repressed it. As long as we structure our lives according to assumed parameters of a static space, so matter is dead, everything else is dead out there, and a rectilinear time, we will be able to ignore or overlook our thorough dependence upon the earth around us. Only when space and time are reconciled into a single unified field of phenomena does the encompassing earth become evident once again in all its power and depth, as the very ground and horizon of all our knowing. So for us to be able to remember, literally put back together, remember, put back together who we are as the earth, we need to get beyond this traumatized, linear race of progress, even expressed in spiritual traditions, where it's all about transcendence, away from the body, away from the earth, back into an understanding of this evolutionary process, where we actually are growing out from the heart, up into greater consciousness, but at the same time deeper into our bodies and deeper into our relationship to the earth and each other. Because it's only when we do that that we'll be able to heal the pain that exists from our forgetting and release the promise of, as Ken says, the great goddess, to be able to access the information and wisdom that will enable us to transition into the next phase. So just a couple of references if you want to look anything up afterwards. There's 3 books in the pipeline. There's The Pain and the Promise that'll go into this, that whole thesis in more detail. Look at what's the details of the pain, what are the possibilities of the promise. Volution will be more the whole Volution Theory. And then Leading for the Field will be a beautiful artistic handbook of basically 12 principles for leaders to be able to curate the energetic field of the systems that they're a part of. And then here's a few websites. Volution Theory is where all the PhD work is. As my personal website. Humanity Rising is an initiative we're doing at the moment, bringing together speakers to be able who have insights into the potential future. The Ubiverse is the community of global change makers, now 10,000 strong, who are working together to make a positive world. And Ubiquity University is where I work and where we have the learning possibilities for people to dive into all of this and even get degrees in the process if they want to. So there we go.